Hello, Augies Worldwide. I'm Dave Kassler, amateur radio call sign KE0OG, here with another episode of Ask Dave. Today we're going to tackle a tough question. When should I get an amplifier? Now I'm talking about HF here, and I'm talking about generals and extras, but the question is, when should I get an antenna? Now, I have said repeatedly over and over and over again that your basic general station is a 100-watt station. In fact, the reference station is the ICOM 7300, a 100-watt radio. And most generals and extras operate a 100-watt radio, okay? Now, I've often said that what you should do is make sure you have a better antenna, and only then would you look at an antenna. Here is the general rule. If you can hear people, but they can't hear you, and if this occurs repeatedly, if you can hear people, but they can't hear you, it's time to consider an amplifier. You can't work somebody that you can't hear, but if you can hear them and can't work them, time to look at an amplifier. Now, the question for today comes from James Adams. He's KB9JMU, Jim. And he says, I've often heard that you should upgrade your antenna before you add a power amp. Yes, in general, that's true. You get more bang for the buck by putting that buck into a better antenna, and it'll probably take less bucks than an amplifier. But how do you know that an antenna upgrade is needed? He says, I have an ICOM IC7300 running through an MFJ 929 tuner into a ground-mounted high-gain 4-band vertical 40, 20, 15, and 10 that I bought in the year 2000. With the tuner, I am able to make contacts across all the HF bands. Great! Super! And if you can make lots of contacts, if the CQs that you go after get answered, if when you call CQ you get answered, you've got a very nice balance. Okay, so how do I know that my antenna can be better? When should I look or listen for that might indicate less than the best antenna performance? What tests can I run? I can afford a different antenna if I can determine that I need to upgrade. A tower is not an option. Okay, that's the key statement here. Tower is not an option. So if I can't gain a mite with height, well, maybe. But that ground-mounted vertical, I'm assuming by the vertical you're talking about here, it's like a 14 AVQ, something like that, that needs radials. And ground mounting that is exactly the right thing to do with it. Now, I'm going to tell you something about vertical antennas. Once you have all the radials down, and you've tuned it the very best you can tune it, you're as far as you can go with that antenna. And going any more requires an antenna with gain. Okay? Now, I've said before that if you push a vertical antenna too high in the air, you start to get lensing in the antenna pattern, which is true of dipoles also. But it sounds to me like you've got a perfectly good antenna, and if you're happy with that antenna for transmitting, in other words, if other people can hear you, you're fine, you're done. However, there are many situations where somebody can hear better than they can talk. Okay, so they hear stations, it's a CQ, they try to go after the CQ, they don't pick up on them, they pick up on somebody else. You'll usually find that when you're listening to somebody call CQ, they will tend to come back to the loudest station. Okay? But if you call CQ and nobody comes back to you, or only very infrequently does somebody come back to you, then you might be thinking that you need to do a little bit more on the power out. So, good antenna, or as good as you can get it within reason. Okay, so you've laid 30 radials down around that thing. You've got it well grounded. You've got your station well grounded with lightning arresters, a ground rod right outside. You've got your shack ground running to your station ground. You've got your station ground bonded to your utility ground. You've done all those things. And you still have a problem where you can't get somebody to come back to your CQ, or you call CQ and you can't get through, or it's a contest and you can't break the pile up, or it's a DX station and you can't break the pile up. It's time to consider an amplifier. And I have an amplifier right here. It's an ALS 500M. It's a mobile amp, runs on 12 volts, actually 16. I have a power supply for it that actually cost me more than the amp. I picked up the amp from a ham who would not be using it anymore, and have found that there are times when I want to talk to somebody and they can't hear me. Punch the button, suddenly they can hear me. It's a 500 watt amp, by the way. Let's see. Now, most hams, generals and extras, run about 100 watts in their station. There are a few radios that put out a little bit more power, but you're getting up to the top of the line there. Most of them are 100 watt radios, like the ICOM 7300 that is the reference station that is right there in front of me. Okay, now, how many watts of an amplifier? We're allowed 1,500. Going from 100 watts to 1,000 watts is 10 dB. And then, not quite doubling it again, is another 2 dB or so. So we're talking about 12 dB, or 2S units, if you go to full power. So if you were S7, you'd become S9. The problem with power amplifiers is that they're not cheap. Okay, you're going to spend some money on these things, and they'll cost you more than a new multiband vertical antenna. So that's why I say put the good antenna in it. It sounds like James has got a good antenna already. He can't do a tower, so we can't talk about a Yagi or something like that. So how many watts? Mine is 500. And I found that to be a very nice number. It can be the tiebreaker if I am trying to answer a CQ and they won't come back to me because they can't hear me. I just punch that button and lo and behold, they can hear me. Now, one thing I have noticed, if I call CQ with the higher power, I'll often get a bunch of 100 watt stations coming back to me. They can hear me fine, but I can't hear them because they're only on 100 watt stations. So I would recommend not calling CQ with an amplifier unless you're just desperate and hoping that somebody with an amplifier will come back to you. By the way, there's a sort of hollow sound. You can tell when people are using amplifiers. The amplifiers do slightly distort the signal. You can tell when somebody's on an amplifier. So I'd recommend calling CQ at 100 watts, and then if they have trouble, if they come back to you, you can hear them well, but they're having trouble hearing you, you punch the button. Or if you're trying to answer a CQ and they can't hear you, punch the button. Now, there is a rule in the FCC regs, Part 97, that says to use the minimum amount of power necessary to complete communications. And there are times when that's 100 watts, there are times when that's 20 watts, and there are other times when that's 500 watts. I would tend to think that for a first amplifier, you would stay in the range of 500 to 600 watts. There are several 600 watt amplifiers available. Now, let's talk about a couple technical things. One, tube versus transistor. The fact of the matter is that the transistor technology required to handle high power is there. It's there. You can, with confidence, buy a transistor full legal limit amplifier, but the problem is it's still quite a bit more expensive than a tube amp. Now, tube amps have an advantage, and that is that the pi network on the output is the equivalent of an antenna tuner. And so often with a tube amplifier, you can tweak the tuning. It's the plate and tune, you tweak those until you get it just right and read the instructions very carefully, because you can ruin tubes. You can ruin transistors, but they usually have protective circuits in place. If you use a tube amplifier, you may be able to get by with an antenna that's 4 to 1 SWR, something like that, because you can match that with the plate and load controls on the tube amp. Now, anytime you change frequency, you will have to change your tuning on the thing. Sometimes you get to the point where you know what you got to tweak and just reach over and tweak it. Other times you've got to start over again, and so people will keep charts of, okay, I'm on 20 meters, put plate here, put load here, and see what, and then tune from there. You'll have to fine tune pretty much every time. Now, this will slow you down, changing bands, or changing from one part of a band to another part of a band, okay? But it can be made to work. So tube transistors are much cheaper. Now, I used to be able to say that there were lethal voltages inside of tube amps and not in transistor amps, but that's getting to the point where it's no longer true. The way that you can get power to a, say, 800 watt transistor amp, you're going to have to run 50 to 75 volts. And that's DC, and that is a dangerous voltage at DC. It's not as dangerous as 1,000 volts, but it is still an issue. So beware that anything over 30 volts DC is considered dangerous. Okay, 12 volts you can just touch, but 30 volts is at the limit, and if you're up to 80 volts or so, you're getting into territory where you want to have everything insulated, where nobody can touch anything, and so on. And that can be fun with power supplies where you've got to connect the cables and so on. Usually a transistor amplifier comes with a separate power supply. In some cases, like the ALS 500M, you have to purchase the power supply separately. In other cases, the two are sold together. And we'll look at some of those. Now, the other thing I want to mention is a tuner. If you have a tuner for your 100 watt radio, say it's a 300 watt tuner, okay, you're fine. But you will not put a tuner between your rig and the amplifier. All amplifiers these days have a nice 50 ohm input and will match the 50 ohm output of your, well, it's often called the exciter or the driver. It's your rig. It's what drives the amplifier. And yes, power amplifiers actually consume part of the input. You can't just give it a voltage to amplify. You actually have to send power to it. Now, most amplifiers don't take a full 100 watts input. So there is a connection from the amplifier back to the rig called the ALC, the automatic level control. And there are standards set up for how this works. And what that does is the amplifier will throttle your rig back to the point where it has enough drive. Now, as it turns out, my ALS 500M doesn't have that feature. So I have done experiments and determined that 62 watts is enough watts to properly drive that amplifier. I did that by turning up the power to the point where the ALS 500M was not putting out any more power, then backed it off just a little bit so I wasn't running the thing nonlinear. And it seems to work, and I get good reports. Okay, by the way, if I'm going after a DX station or a contest station or something like that, a lot of contests are run at 100 watts. But boy, if I'm in the contest, but I'm not entering the contest, I just want the DX contact, sometimes my hand just reaches over here and hits that button. So I can make those contacts. They're not valid from my point of view for entering the contest. The other station can go ahead and enter that if they want. I want to talk about a tuner. The tuner, as I said, does not go between your rig and the amplifier. It goes between the amplifier and the antenna. And the tuner must be able to handle all the power that the amplifier puts out. Now, there's a little bit of a misnomer here. If you are feeding a high SWR, you're going to get power back. So if you're putting 600 watts out, you might be getting 200 watts back. That adds up to 800 watts that tuner needs to handle. Not the 600, 800. So you've got to do one of two things. Either have antennas that are pretty close to being in tune, or get a tuner that is bigger than the amplifier. So if you've got a 600 watt amplifier, get a 1,000 watt tuner or something like that, okay? Some of the tuners are very rugged. They're tuned by hand, which again, you've got to retune every time you change bands. There are automatic tuners out there, but they cost a lot of money. They're not cheap, okay? So these are things that you have to consider. Tuners, the transistor versus tube, the power supply, and there's one more thing I should mention. If you go above about 600 watts, you're going to need, and gets expensive, okay? You're going to need to pay an electrician, and you could do this yourself. In a lot of states, you can do your own electrical work, but you still have to pull a permit, and it still has to be inspected. That amplifier is going to want to be like your dryer. Your dryer does not run on 120 volts, it runs on 240 because it's got that big hairy heating element in there, okay? And your amplifier is going to want to run on 240 volts. So that has to be made available in your shack because a normal 15 amp 120 volt circuit will not handle the power requirements of the amplifier. Think of it, 1500 watts class A, which means that it's only running 50 to 70% efficient. So the thing is actually wanting to draw 2000 to 2500 watts. And that is way more than a normal 110 volt circuit will do. My amplifier here with this huge 75 amp power supply, that's 75 amps at 16 volts, plugs into 110, but the lights do dim a bit on consonants and broad vowels. It's pushing the limit on what I've got here. The power supply will rewire for 220 if I want it to. Okay, why don't we take a moment and just look at some amplifiers? Okay, and all the caveats that I've talked about here. If, and I'm making the assumption that you've done your best to put in a good antenna. Okay, you've added the radials, you've tuned it, you've done all of this other stuff, you've got good quality coax, good connectors, lightning protection, grounding, all of these other things like that, and you're running a 100 watt radio. Now, let me just digress here for a moment. If you have a 20 watt radio like a G90, QST says if you put an amplifier on that, you will definitely exceed FCC limits for spurious emissions. So I'm talking about a 100 watt radio like the ICOM 7300, an FT991A, an FT450, TS590, all kinds of radios that will work very well with that. By the way, I have up on the shelf behind me a radio that the Yaesu up there, which is a tube type radio, and it actually puts out more than 100 watts. So if I wanted to pair that tube rig with a tube amp, I would go consult an expert, because it's a whole different story, okay? I'm talking about a standard modern transistor radio going into either a tube amp or a transistor amp where everything is a very nice 50 ohms, okay? Let's look at some amplifiers. I've got a few, and I'm just going to look at the MFJ catalog, okay? Lots of people make amplifiers. MFJ makes a ton of them, okay? Their brand name, Ameritron, is where they have most of their amplifiers, but not all of them, okay? Okay, we're looking at the MFJ catalog here. And this is an Ameritron 600 watt solid state, 160 to 6 meters. Look at the price on that. Okay, $2,099. Now this comes with the switching power supply. Or for an extra $200, you can get a transformer power supply, which is a whole bunch bigger and you don't need. Now this particular thing has a band select on here. I think there is a feature where you can have it do automatic band select. And this is how you trim the ALC so you're getting the right power from your rig. Over here is the different meters you can get out of it. Operate standby, on and off, okay? Normally you would turn it on. That brings the power supply, a big hairy power supply, up. Now, if we go down here, we can see kind of what's inside of the thing. It's not small. Amplifiers are not small. Okay, and here is a remote interface for $600. Good grief, I'll find desk space for this rather than pay the $600 for a remote. Here is a 1200 watt solid state amplifier, $3,000. Woo! Okay, and then another 139 so your rig can switch the bands for you. They offer some output meters, but the thing is that the antenna or the amplifier has these meters in them. Now here is a no-tune solid-state FET amplifier, 600 watts, okay, for $2,000. It includes the power supply. It's 2 units, see? Okay, and these inrush current protector put something in there that should be in the power supply itself to keep the power from rushing in there too fast. Here's the mobile. This is the one I have. I have an earlier version of this. Now this is 500 watts. Here is the price, $1,000. Wow, that's a lot cheaper. But you do have to remember to buy the power supply. This is the power supply. It says it has Anderson power poles. Believe me, they don't make Anderson power poles for this particular amp. This takes the standard 15/30 amp Anderson power pole connectors. You actually will need to connect your 75 amps to this front right here, okay? Now here is a tube amplifier. This has got 3 tubes in it right here, okay? And look at the price. 600 watts for $1,100, okay? 600 watts. Notice the price just dropped like mad, okay? And this is what's inside of it. Now it's got tubes in it. Now, I want to warn you, treat them nicely. Treat those tubes nicely. Don't load it up every time so you can get the max power out of them. Back them off just a little bit so that, and the way you do that is by turning down your drive. Now see the load and plate? These two are your old-fashioned tuning controls for tube-type rigs. Load and plate. And you dip the plate, and you get the load, you move the load around, which will cause the plate to change. As you move the load, you re-dip the plate, and you'll see it on the, by dipping it means the meter comes down a little bit, okay? And you keep doing that till you get the most power out. Okay, now here is an 811H for 1200 watts. I'm sorry, $1,200 for 800 watts out. Again, a tube. Here it is with 1, 2, 3, 4 tubes in there. Okay, now tubes do go soft with time, unlike transistors. Here is a kilowatt right here for $1,800. This right here is a tube amplifier, and you see the big tube there. Look at that weird big giant thing. By the way, there are lethal voltages inside there. You want to be extremely careful. Here's 4 tubes for 1,300 watts for 2,000. Okay, we're getting up in power more. Okay, here's another 800. This is a 1,250 watt AL800 single tube. It looks to me like 2 tubes down there. Okay, or here's 2 iMac tubes to get 1,250 watts. And now we're at the legal limit. Okay, the AL1500 amplifier with that particular iMac tube. This is a super high power tube. Now, one of the problems with iMac tubes is iMac, E-I-M-A-C, no longer makes amateur radio tubes. Okay, there are a lot in the pipeline, but they're hard to get. Okay, so keep that in mind. But this is full legal limit. Some of your vertical antennas, the verticals, like the high gain verticals, won't allow you to run the legal limit. Make sure your antenna can handle the legal limit. Okay, now let's look down here. These are, oh, here's a, for QSK, if you want rapid receiving, transceiver front end protector, all kinds of little goodies that you can get with their amplifiers. So that pretty much gives you, an idea of what kind of amplifiers are out there. Now, there are 1,500 watt solid state amplifiers available from companies like Elecraft and so on. ANAN has a series of amplifiers. Those are made in India. There's just many different things you can do, and you can get all sorts of automatic features with them too, to where they will do automatic tuning, automatic band shift. They'll follow whatever you do on the radio, and you can be sure that you're not doing anything for the amplifier. Now, the biggest single thing you may have seen in this is sticker shock for these amplifiers. They are not cheap, and they do not help you hear the other station any better. So if you can work every station you can hear, if every station you call comes back to you, at least eventually, okay, you're not looking for an amplifier. But if you're in the position, and there are a lot of people in this position, they can hear the other station, but the other station can't hear them. That's when you want to start looking at an amplifier. So I hope this has been kind of a helpful discussion here, and we can, talk about this. Normally, I would say for a new general that wait a year, at least, till you've got a lot of experience with your radio, and you can say definitively, so definitively you're willing to put a couple grand down on this, you can say definitively, I can hear, but I can't be heard. Then it's time to think about an amplifier. If you can be heard and everything you can hear you, and so on, you're balanced just right. You don't need the amplifier. If you are balanced, but you want to go beyond, now we're talking a tower, a beam, an amplifier, all these things, because that beam is going to help you hear better. Okay? So there you go. There you have it. Another video from Ask Dave. Please subscribe to this channel. Also, please check out dcasler.com/support for different ways that you can help fund this channel. And until we next meet, 73.